Chapter 1 The Pupil. On a small farm deep within the great northern forest of New Canada, a lightly glowing man watched a young boy spin through the air as he attacked several clay targets that lay spread out before him. The boy jabbed his staff and moved his body in a practiced routine of attack and defense. The two stood outdoor in the peaceful morning air upon a practice mat that sat in a position designed to catch the most sunlight. The man who watched the pupil stood off to the side of the mat and called out ideas for the boy to consider as he leapt and dived into a roll. The man was tall and slim and had a light glow that emanated from his body, hair, and eyes. As the pupil finished his attacking movements, the master directed the boy who stood positioned in front of him. In a gentle but powerful voice, he guided his students' movements and said, "Excellent, now hold the position, hold it, hold it. Now release your reserve of air in the thrust. Very good." The pupil was young. He was a boy of perhaps 6 years of age who now performed a finishing attack stance. A practice staff was held to his side where the position of his final strike had finished. A prominent diamond-shaped birthmark rested underneath the boy's left eye, and the mark reflected in sharp contrast as the sun touched the pattern upon the boy's cheek. "You have mastered the second form, young Jacen," the man said. He was wearing a gardening apron over his cotton overalls and walked over to the young boy and knelt in front of him. His skin, hair, and eyes all emanated a subtle glow. The 6-year-old looked into his master's glowing eyes and instinctively reached out with his special sense. The old master was smiling at him and gently touched the young boy's chin as he said, "I'm very proud of you." The boy's sense could tell his master was not lying, and he felt a flood of security and protection fall over him like a blanket. After a moment, the master stood up and said, "Let's take a break from the attack lessons and enjoy the moment." He walked over to a bag of supplies that rested against a wooden bench. Sitting down on the bench, he pulled out several pears which he ripped apart into pieces with his powerful hands and carefully placed the chunks of fruit between them to eat. The young boy quickly walked over to the nearby shed and carefully placed his staff next to the other training implements that were attached to the wall of the small paddock where they kept their mule. After the boy had made sure the wooden practice staff would stay where he placed it, he joined the master on the bench and began eating one of the pears. The master ate his pear and closed his glowing eyes as he savored the flavor of the fruit. The young boy looked up at him as they ate, then looked out over the nearby area of land that spread out in front of their small cabin. The porch of the 2-room cabin they shared rested against the training pad and overlooked the nearby enclosed garden and livestock enclosure. The building was positioned on an acre of land that had been carefully cleared within the great western forest not far from a small grower's village. The land rested up against a large rocky mountainside that blocked entry from one side into their small valley. Many trees of the forest surrounded the location, and a light breeze blew through the tall limbs of oak and pine. Jacen could hear bird song from the creatures within the trees and took that moment to ask his master a question. "Master, why do the birds sing?" he asked. The glowing man looked at his pupil with delight and said, "Jacen, what a soothing mind you have to notice the birds singing." He paused for a moment, then said, "The birds sing because that is what their heart tells them to do. And in like fashion, if you listen very carefully, your heart will tell you what song you are supposed to sing all throughout your life." The young boy looked at his master with a quizzical expression that made the man laugh in pleasure. "In time you will come to understand what I mean. Give yourself that time and you will hear your heart song play," he said as he stood up and stretched his spine. "Come," said the master after a moment, "let's continue our practice." The boy finished his fruit snack, then walked over to stand in front of the man upon the practice pad. The man approached the boy and said, "Show me the defensive stance, first position." The young boy took a deep breath, then came to a stance, holding his forearms in a rigid posture. "Good. Now very carefully, I will strike your solar plexus and you will redirect the blow with your outward breath." The pupil took on a concentrated look and nodded when he was ready. The man struck the boy in the chest with a fraction of his great strength. The boy expertly timed his outward breath with the blow, and although he slid backwards several feet, he had not broken the posture. "Excellent," said his master. "Now again, and more strongly." The master struck the young boy again in the chest with slightly more power. The boy slid back several more feet, but had still not broken the stance. They continued working in this fashion for some time, then the master called an end to the lessons and they got to work on the daily chores. As the lightly glowing man walked down to the garden and checked on the summer squash they were growing, the boy began to move about his chores. He turned away to feed the chick creatures that roamed the property and moved to scrape out their coop. After he had finished gathering the droppings into a large wooden bucket, he dragged the container out past the edge of the field into the beginnings of the large forest. As the young boy walked toward the large compost pile, he thought about what his master had said. "Listen to your heart and it will tell you what song you are to sing," he heard his master say again in his mind. After he emptied the bucket into the compost pile, he put the container down and sat upon a small rocky outcropping. Boy closed his eyes and focused on his breathing the way his master had taught him. He concentrated on feeling like he was the breath moving into and out of his lungs. He relaxed and tried to hear his heart, but could not make out anything. Just then he heard the whispering sounds that he sometimes heard as he fell asleep at night. He was not alarmed, for he had heard the whispered for as long as he remembered, but none of them had ever caused him harm. He decided to try to hear them better and listen to the sounds more carefully. After several minutes, the normal sounds of the forest died down, and he was able to make out several whispering voices. Gold and riches nearby in the village," he heard one whisper saying frantically over and over. A different whispering sound came from behind him, and he heard it saying in a slithering tone, Repeat my words and you will have unlimited power. The young boy did not pay attention to any of the whispers. He had told his master about hearing them long ago, and the man had told him to ignore the sounds. Just as he was about to break his concentration and head back to his chores, he heard a giggling whisper from right beside him. The boy looked sharply at his side, expecting to see someone sitting there, but all he saw was the dark forest air and the compost bucket. The giggling came again from his other side, and he heard a young feminine voice say, "My boy, my big strong boy, what is your name, my big strong boy?" It was a young girl's voice about the same age as he. The voice was imploring, as if she wanted something from him that he could not identify. He reached out with his special sense and did not feel any menace coming from the whispering voice. "Hello?" he asked. The voice giggled again and said, my boy, such a happy boy. What is your name?" Once again, the quality of the voice was imploring, as if it were seeking something. "Who's there?" the boy demanded as he looked around for the owner of the voice. "It is only I, your friend, happy boy, friend, came the voice, this time in a mildly triumphant tone. He looked around for whoever was telling him these things, but could not see anyone. He jumped around a bush, expecting to see someone there, but only heard the giggling again. "Come out! I want to see you!" young Jacen cried. He heard the giggling one more time, then heard the young girl's voice say for the final time, my boy, you should come back tomorrow and we can play together." He heard the giggling trailing away, and after a moment, the normal sounds of the forest returned. The young boy looked all over but could no longer hear any whispers. After several minutes, he grabbed the empty bucket and returned to the path leading away from the compost pile. He glanced back one last time and wondered about the fun-sounding voice he had heard within his mind. The ancient Omegan known as Hecate Riley patiently worked his way through the small garden. He used his greatly enhanced vision to assess the condition of the vegetables as they grew next to each other. Just then he noticed the boy returning from the forest path. Hecate glanced at his pupil as the boy returned from the forest and noted he held an unusual expression etched upon his young face. "Jacen, is everything all right?" he called out. The boy stopped and looked up at the sound of his master's voice. After a moment, he said, "Yes, master, everything is fine." He then returned to his chores. Hecate watched the boy for a moment, then returned to his garden. As he pruned several medium-sized apple trees, he thought back of the many events that had occurred in the last 1,000 years. His hyper-evolved mind replayed the day he had last spoken to his father, the Omegan known as Jacob Riley. In the years after the apocalypse of 2043, his father had become the sole ruler of their large tribe, a group of people made up of Baton families and survivors of the Great Fall who lived within the borders of his father's lands. Despite his many evolved abilities, his father had been magically seduced by the princess of a neighboring tribe. Eventually, the two had mated and married. As soon as she had become pregnant, the princess had grown cold toward her new husband and had removed herself to her father's large palatial home 80 miles to the east. She had been in her final week of the pregnancy when his father had summoned him. Hecate had grown distrustful of his father ever since his uncle Sam had died in a fight between the two men. After his uncle's death, his father had absorbed his brother's molecular technology into his own body. In the following years, his personality had subtly changed for the worse. Over the next several decades, he had radically expanded his lands by the use of force and had become a cold and ruthless dictator of the people that depended on the resources of his large castle. Their final discussion had been about kidnapping the newborn child. They had been walking through one of the lower levels of the stronghold, along a lit pathway that overlooked a construction bay where several technicians worked on mechanical devices below. "I want this situation taken care of," his father had rumbled in his deep and powerful voice. Hecate looked at his father, who walked some feet ahead of him. He saw a powerful-looking man of average height, with mildly Hispanic features. The man's skin, hair, and eyes all glowed with the same subtle emanating energy that exuded from his own skin. "How could this have happened?" he had demanded in an unaccustomed show of anger. "You, a man of your years, and not to mention how this baby may influence our plans for the future. And the woman! How could you have had offspring with her? You must see what she's into just as much as I do. I don't understand this obsession you have with her," he had said to his father. The older man had shrugged his powerful shoulders and said, "Hecate, I'm human, and I still make mistakes. In fact, maybe we all never stop making mistakes so that we never stop learning." Hecate had sighed and shook his head, then looked at his father and asked, "What do you want me to do?" "When the baby is born next week, I want you to steal it from its mother and take it away from here. I've made arrangements so that we won't ever see it again in this lifetime," the older man had said. "I won't kill a baby!" cried Hecate. "Calm down, Hecate. I'm not asking you to kill the child. I want you to get the child to our contacts in Kath, and I'll contact them with further instructions. Once you leave the child in their care, return here. The child won't be harmed, I promise," the powerful leader had responded. His father turned his back as he spoke the last sentence and began walking away. Hecate had reluctantly agreed, and a week later, the mother had given birth. The child was born a male, and by the ritual practices of its mother's tribe, the infant was now considered heir candidate for the future leadership of the tribe that had been formed with the powerful Omegans. Hecate had planned out the kidnapping with all the efficiency of his greatly enhanced abilities. Just before dawn on the second day of the child's life, he had quietly slipped into the catacombs beneath the palatial mansion of the princess's home and had kidnapped the child. 2 weeks later, he had returned to his father's stronghold. One of his father's personal guards found him as he jumped off his hovercycle and gave word that his father was waiting to speak with him. He acknowledged the man and walked into the large interior of the stronghold toward his father's office to report in. After several minutes, he arrived at his father's private wing of the large castle. Hecate approached a large oaken door that was carved with an old-fashioned ceremonial motif. The Omegan knocked on the door and heard his father within say, "Enter." He walked into the large office. "How's everything here?" Hecate asked. His father sat at a desk in a large leather chair they had rescued in a city raid many years before. As was his custom, the powerful leader had decorated his desk with a single red rose that was in full bloom. Its odor was heavy and pungent in the small space. His powerful voice rumbled out an answer to Hecate's question. "Things are quieting down here. Did you take care of the child?" he asked. Hecate responded, "Yes, but I've made alternate arrangements to ensure we won't hear from the child again." He braced himself for what he knew was coming as the air in the room suddenly became noticeably warmer. When Jacob next spoke, the air was charged with a grinding metallic noise that accompanied the sound of each word leaving the powerful man's mouth. "Alternate arrangements? What the fuck have you done?" he thundered from where he sat at his desk. He had stood up from the chair and had clenched his fists as the strange power of his words bathed over Hecate, who absorbed the brunt of the power with a grimace upon his face. A sharp and unpleasant odor became pervasive in the room, and the atmosphere was hot and charged. As his Omegan body began to harden for battle, Hecate summoned his own vocal powers and responded with an equal measure of the special vocal energy. As the primary general of our forces, it is my job to make decisions. I used my judgment on this action, he responded. The power of his voice vibrated back throughout the room and echoed loudly in the enclosed environment. The tension in the room was palpable as the two Omegans worked to control the strange energy at their disposal. After a moment of sustained tension, the feeling of power diminished and the older man spoke again. "Okay, I'll trust your judgment for the moment," he said. His voice had returned to normal and there was no longer any power in the words. After another moment, the air returned to its regular temperature, and the arcane humming that had been noticeable moments before was no longer felt. The powerful man slowly sat down and spoke again and asked, "Are the Caths still involved?" Hecate's body began to relax back into its normal proportions, and he said, "No, and I would suggest we send them word that you have made other arrangements with your thanks." "Very well. I'll want to talk about this in more detail once you've settled in here," said Jacob. "Understood," Hecate responded. He began to walk away, paused in his step, then turned back to address his leader. The atmosphere in the room suddenly became charged again, and the buildup of power was felt a moment before it returned, in full force, as Hecate addressed the older man once again. "For the record, I will never do that again," he thundered. Power pressed out with the sound of his voice, pushing out against the other Omegan and causing the wall to his left to suddenly splinter with a sharp cracking noise. Hecate turned away and began to walk out of the room. Just before he left, his father called out to him, "Hecate, wait, I'm proud of you. I love you," he said. The last words were spoken with the full measure of the man's hypnotic powers. The undulating energy of the words flowed over Hecate, causing him to reel back as he was engulfed in its powerful wake. He shook his head clear and glared at the older man before leaving the room and shutting the large oak door behind him. Hecate knew as he shut the door to the office that his father would not let the matter end. He had become more and more controlling over the years, and ever since the death of his Uncle Sam, his father's behavior was often erratic and violent. He also realized he would need to take drastic efforts to save the child, and that it was only a matter of time before his father would learn where he had hidden the infant. With no other solutions in mind, Hecate traveled to the old engineering department within the massive stronghold. Bent over a badly dented and scratched up workbench was his old friend Benedict, one of the few original Badens that was still alive all these years later. The old engineer was looking at a device that he patiently worked on with a refined set of tools. Hecate calculated that he would need to secure the man's help to effectively execute his plan to prevent his father from killing the strange child he had kidnapped. After several promises were made, the old Baden had agreed to help him and had secretly stolen explosives from the stronghold's armory. The next day, he had met Hecate at the old energy resonance distortion emitter chamber, now long abandoned. Hecate arrived at the old building with the child wrapped in a bundle of fine cloth. He had dressed himself in travel armor and had armed himself with his 2 whip swords. Working together, he and Benedict had lined the ERD capsule with explosives. As they worked, Hecate mentally made plans for his upcoming defection from his father's service. The older Hecate remembered how he and Benedict had brought the old AI system online and activated the ERT emitter tower to open a portal to another time and place. Hecate had taken the infant over to the portal of swirling energy and looked down at his half-brother one last time. Gently kissing the child's forehead, he threw the child into the portal. As he did so, he noticed a man hidden in the shadows waiting at the other side who caught the child as it had traveled through the strange doorway between worlds. Suddenly there was a loud commotion at the entrance of the small building, and his father and several of his personal guard began charging into the area. "Hecate!" roared his father. Hecate saw his father rocketing toward he and his fellow conspirator in a burst of speed and quickly deactivated the technology, causing the portal to shrink closed. He saw a glimmer of light come from the eyes of the man beyond the doorway just as one of his father's guards leapt into the closing corona of energy. Hecate pulled out one of his whip-thin swords and sliced it down in a powerful swipe across the control board of the RTAC computer. The screen was cut in two in a shower of sparks and electrical buzzing. As the portal had closed and killed the guard who had tried to jump through, Hecate screamed at Benedict to activate the explosives. Benedict stood behind a safety screen and hit the remote charge they had prepared, which caused the explosives to begin lighting off one by one. Most of his father's personal guard were caught in the blast along with the ERD emitter. After a moment, the air cleared to reveal that the machinery had become a burnt wreck of twisted metal. Several charred bodies lay burning upon the ground. His father had been pushed back by the explosion but had not been harmed and began running toward Hecate once again. Hecate had leapt away just in time as the great building was consumed in the flames of a final explosion. He rolled to a stop within the nearby forest and began sprinting away. The sound of his father's screams of rage were eventually left further and further behind him. In a strange flicker of memory, he replayed the events that had occurred on the other side of the doorway that had appeared 6 years ago at the remote forest destination. With outstretched hands, he had waited in the shadows as the portal had appeared in front of him. He saw his younger self throw the child through the opening, and he gently caught the infant as the opening of the doorway had begun to close. Just then, one of his father's old personal guards had dived at the closing portal and had landed with only half of his body through the doorway. The ancient Hecate had covered the infant with his own body just as the man screamed and was cut in half. The upper portion of the guard's lifeless torso landed unmoving on the ground, and blood spilled out everywhere. The Omegan quickly took the infant away from the grisly scene to the small farm he had built and had begun to raise the boy. He had started training the boy in the ways of attack and defense just as soon as the child had become old enough to understand. The Ancient One was brought out of the memories of his rescue of the child, and he glanced over at the boy as the young one moved through the routines of his daily chores. As he watched, Hecate reflected upon the many things he had discovered about his younger half-brother. The boy had an untiring way about him that marked him as having gained his father's Omegan genetic traits after a fashion. He never became sick and was stronger than a boy his age should be. On several occasions, the child had said he heard strange voices and sometimes awoke from violent dreams as Hecate watched over him. And then there was the strange effects of tasting blood upon the child's constitution and behavior. He wondered about the boy's potential as he reflected on the many plans he had set in motion over the years. Someday soon, he intended to begin a rebellion against the tyrannical rule of his mad, immortal father. He watched the boy move through his chores and felt with every fiber of his being that the child was somehow essential to the future of humanity that still existed within the world. As he remembered his father's screams of rage, he silently vowed that he would do his best to prepare his younger brother for the upcoming rough times ahead.